So welcome to the Cafe Scientifique presentation of cellular agriculture and cultured meat with our guest today, Avery Parkinson. George will be introducing Avery formally in a moment, but just a couple reminders about who we are at Cafe Scientifique. Cafe Scientifique is a series of lectures and events that are more science-oriented. Certainly, we like a good discussion at Cafe Scientifique, and so oftentimes it's a roundtable format. Otherwise, we have people in the know in various areas of science and technology, and we'll be presenting those to you throughout the year. So, of course, if you've come to us through Meetup, that's exactly the place to be. Just to be aware that the Cafe Scientifique is sponsored by Halton Peel Humanist Community, HPHC, hp-hc.ca. We're a group in Halton Peel, Mississauga sort of based, and Oakville, etc. And we present a whole series of lectures, not only under the Cafe Scientifique banner, but also under our own banner, relating to science, to humanism, to secularism, and to social causes, and just a good discussion of things, of topics that are of interest to us, presented thoughtfully and reviewed critically. And so if you're interested in being a part of our organization in any way, you like what we do at Cafe Scientifique, or you're interested in the Halton Peel Humanist Community, then you can find everything at hp-hc.ca. And just a reminder that we will be having our annual meeting in June 7th at the aforementioned, not Franklin House, where we used to use our venue back in Streetsville, but in fact, we've moved now to a new venue, Stonehooker Brewery. Stonehooker Brewery is on Lakeshore, just east of Cawthra. Fantastic brewery with 12, a variety of their own beers locally brewed on tap. A small but powerful menu with a proper chef. So to give you something better than rubbery quesadillas and maybe the odd terrible burger like it was at other places. And this place is a lot better, and it's a great venue as well. It's a good size venue with all sorts of things. So we hope that we're going to have a long-term partnership with Stonehooker Brewery, the first of which will start on June 7th at our annual meeting at 7 p.m. So if you're interested in that, then of course check on Meetup, or of course become a member of the Halton Peel Humanist Community. So we're going to get started now. Linda, did you have something you wanted to ask at the moment?
What's the parking like at the brewery?
It's excellent. There's hundreds, literally 100 spots.
So it's free parking.
Free parking right there. Yeah, it's
thank you.
Good area for that.
When you first pull into the Stonehooker Brewery, the parking lot looks congested, but there's plenty of parking in the back of the building. So just proceed to the back of the building.
Will you be sending a link to that so I know the spelling and know how to Google it?
It's absolutely. Actually, an invitation has already gone out to the annual meeting to all members. So if you haven't seen that yet, check your email and check your various communication outlets. But certainly we'll be keeping you abreast of the situation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now let me now turn proceedings over to our presenter of the presenter, George Cardahi, the Vice President of the Halton Peel Humanist Community and lead organizer for Cafe Scientifique. George would like to say a couple things before we get started with the main presentation for today. George.
Indeed, folks. 2 hours ago, while I was kind of doing the last preparation for this event, the news came of another shooting. 14 children have been killed at a school an elementary school in Texas. I'm kind of sickened by this continued violence that is meaningless. Less than 2 weeks after the racist shooting in Buffalo, and I don't know exactly how to process this, but I needed to say something as we go along with this meeting and so on before we continue forward. I don't know if there is a desire to have like 30 seconds or a minute of silence for this, but it's not as if it's going to achieve anything. I'm sure that those stupid, murderous events are going to continue until they get, there is a political consciousness that that has an effect on it, and I don't know what to say because I'm so upset about it. But can we have let's say a minute of silence, please? Okay, maybe we should proceed. Folks, welcome. I love eating meat. It tastes good, especially marinated and barbecued. I also love animals, much better alive than dead. As a child, I remember seeing a cow slaughter. A sight once seen cannot be unseen. I do not expect that mankind ceases its appetite for eating animals, though one can still advocate for humane slaughter methods. Beyond animal welfare, there is a matter of environmental welfare. President Ronald Reagan was widely mocked for saying, and I can't find the exact quote, that cow farts were a major source of methane which damaged the ozone layer. Subsequent events indicated that he was right. These days, the major environmental damage attributed to raising cattle is the clearing of Amazonian forest to be replaced with grasslands for grazing cattle, which replace CO2 sinks with CO2 emitting cows. I am not a vegetarian, though I try as much to reduce meat consumption. For the last few years, I have been fascinated with new products trying to taste like meat but made from plants. And some I tried are really good. At least I think so. 2 years ago, I watched a documentary called Meat, the Future, which narrates the story of a company called Memphis Meats, now Upside Foods, I believe, that is one of the pioneers in the field of growing real meat from animal cells. I was hooked. And this brings us to tonight's presentation. Avery Parkinson is the Executive Director of Cellular Agricultural Canada. Founded in 2019, Cellular Agricultural Canada described itself as the first nationwide interdisciplinary not-for-profit shaping the cellular agricultural field in Canada. Prior to her current position at CAC, Avery held positions at New Harvest, the Good Food Institute, Big Ideas Ventures, and the Protein Report. Clearly, she is very well versed in the field. Avery, the mic is yours and the screen are yours. The mic and the screen are yours.
All right, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I will just share my screen here. All right. So, there we go. All right, so as George mentioned, my name's Avery and I am the Executive Director of Cellular Agriculture Canada, which was founded a couple years ago. And the intention behind CAC is really to create a very unified field in Canada in order to drive forward innovation within the cellular agriculture industry and make it a very profitable and successful industry in Canada. So that means uniting investors, academics, researchers, startups, in order to and the general public and regulators in order to create more knowledge and public awareness about this field. So I guess just by way of introduction, I will show you this photo. So back in 2013, a burger was taste tested on live television. This burger took 3 months to make and cost $330,000. Probably one of the most conventional foodstuffs of the Western world in particular, this burger was anything but. The reason for this high cost was because it was produced using a technology called cellular agriculture. So cellular agriculture, as was mentioned before, is the field of growing agricultural products directly from cell cultures instead of using livestock. So at the moment, primary research has revolved around growing things like meat. So beef, pork, poultry, seafood, those kinds of things that especially in North America, we regularly eat, as well as animal products like milk and egg white proteins and cheese in cell cultures. So instead of raising, for instance, a cow from birth in order to get milk and in order to get meat, cellular agriculture presents an alternative way to get the same things that we already know and love eating without all of the problems, the environmental problems, the ethical and public health problems associated with raising livestock. So I guess the main question that people often ask is kind of like, why do this? Why is this technology important? And what relevance does it actually bear? Like, why would we actually consider investing in this idea? So it's predicted that the global population will be between 9 and 11 billion people by 2050. The global demand for animal-based foods will accordingly skyrocket, probably by at least 70%, probably more, almost doubling from current levels. The growing global demand for meat and animal products illustrates that people aren't necessarily ready to change their eating habits from meat to plant-based alternatives and proteins. So instead of urging people to accept individual change, and independently convert to plant-based diets, the next best option is to find a better way to produce the things that we already currently know and love to eat, which is meat. And this is exactly what cellular agriculture offers. So the large amount of resources required by livestock agriculture reflects its significant environmental footprint. Approximately 25% of the Earth's surface is taken up for livestock farming, and this is approximately 70% of all land used for agriculture. So I saw an interesting statistic the other day, which actually said that, if all of the land that was used for human civilization, the settled part of it, like buildings, like for houses, businesses, those kinds of things, that would take up a part of the land the size of Libya. Whereas if you were to group together all the land used for agriculture, animal agriculture in particular, it would take up all of North and South America. So scaling this clearly is really not feasible for our growing population and our growing percentage of the population that's interested in consuming animal products. So beyond the environmental impact, cellular agriculture would of course impact animal welfare, because without actually requiring living animals and livestock, it reduces the number of animals implicated at all in the food production process. And then of course, regarding human health, meat produced with cellular agriculture would not be fed the large amount of antibiotics that currently characterizes very intensive models of agriculture. So in the US, but in many Western countries, nearly 80% of all antibiotics sold go directly to livestock and animals involved in agriculture. Antibiotic usage in agriculture has led to various health issues, such as the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which are a big compromise to most of, modern medicine with antibiotics, and also the development of very virulent pathogens that have a high potential to start pandemics or epidemics, which, as we've seen in the past couple of years, are not to be taken lightly. And of course, as the pandemic's impact is felt globally, the importance of food security is starting to be discussed in places like North America and Europe, or rather that conversation is being sort of taken into the more mainstream. COVID-19 has highlighted the need for resilience in the food supply chain to ensure that people don't lack access or availability to meet all their food needs and their nutrition needs. Cellular agriculture can in a way address that, not uniquely, but if implemented in the right way, can address that by being a way to produce food locally anywhere and everywhere on the planet, including in outer space. So it's very fitting for remote communities, for rural communities, for communities that might often be susceptible to natural disasters. It will just, if implemented in the right way, increase resilience in the food supply. And so food security is a major reason why there's an explosion of interest for cellular agriculture, particularly in Eastern Asia. So Singapore is probably one, if not the leading country when it comes to the development of this industry. And the reason is because they were particularly interested in being able to find a way to produce more of their food as their population increases and as their supply of arable land decreases, so that they're not relying on importing their food and they have more sovereignty and more control over being able to feed their own population. So for these main reasons, resource consumption, animal welfare, food safety and security, cellular agriculture does present some viability in terms of feeding our growing population. So now for a bit more of the scientific side, how does it work? So the whole process begins with stem cells, which are cells which retain the ability to differentiate into many or all different kinds of specialized cells. So muscle cells, nerve cells, blood cells, those kinds of things. So these cells are extracted sometimes from a live animal, but as we'll get to in a minute, usually from a pre-established cell line. These cell lines are basically retrieved from cell banks and are engineered in such a way that they retain the ability to divide and grow almost indefinitely. So theoretically, instead of always having to go to the animal to get your starter cells, which would defeat the purpose of cellular agriculture, you would theoretically be able to do one biopsy on an animal. And if you preserve that cell line, that one animal in a way could feed the entire human population indefinitely, which is pretty neat. So then these stem cells are put into a culture media, which is a formula containing all the essential nutrients, so carbohydrates, sodium, different minerals, fats, proteins, amino acids, as well as additional growth factors that the cells need in order to differentiate or in order to proliferate and increase their population, which is essentially just what an animal would do when they eat food. This is like almost the equivalent of all of those nutrients that they would consume, just delivered in a more direct way to the cells. Now, one of, I guess, the main sort of current complications with this culture media is that one of the main components of it is typically something called FBS, or fatal bovine serum, which is a byproduct of the dairy industry. In particular, it is the blood of fetal calves. And the reason it's used, or it has been used in pharmaceutical and biomedical applications, is because it contains a lot of these different growth factors that have been shown to be really helpful for cell proliferation. But one obvious downside is that it still comes from the animal. It's also very expensive, and it's also very variable batch to batch. So it's not very effective when you're trying to like quantify a bioprocess that you're able to reuse over and over, which would be favorable for industry. So a number of startups, there's one actually in Canada called Future Fields in Edmonton, is working on developing these growth factors independent of animal byproducts, which would bring down cost, which would be more in line with sort of the ethical claims of cellular agriculture, and then also just make more sense on an industrial level. So after that serum is added, the cells are put into what's known as a bioreactor. And this machine provides the different environmental cues that are necessary for the cells to grow and to differentiate into muscle tissue and fat tissue, which is what essentially constitutes a steak or a chicken leg or anything that you actually want to eat. A bioreactor, it sounds kind of like an intimidating machine in a way, but it's something that's already used to brew things like beer and ferment yogurt. It's basically just a big metal vat, which has a really warm temperature and is able to like really just deliver all the nutrients that the cells need to help them grow. And so this would kind of be the extent of the bioprocess for things like ground beef, for instance, something that is relatively unstructured and homogeneous. However, for something like steak, for instance, like a cut of steak, as many of us probably know, it's not characterized just by the way it tastes, but by the way the tissue is arranged. So there's a specific configuration in which fat is overlaid with muscle tissue, and if you're eating something with a bone, that also comes in. So just allowing these cells to sort of float around in a bioreactor isn't conducive to actually creating that, which is why something called a scaffold is introduced. So a scaffold is a kind of mold that you seed these cells to so that it actually grows in the shape that you want it to. And there are additional considerations that come in, like what kind of material you're making the scaffold out of. Or will the scaffold be removed at the end of the bioprocess, that have to be taken into consideration. But that is the current thinking on how we produce some of these more sophisticated kinds of things. So now we'll get to some misconceptions about cellular agriculture. So the first one is, is it actually meat? And I guess we could start, I like to approach this question with an Oxford Dictionary definition, which defines meat as the flesh of any animal, typically a mammal or bird, as food. Now, there is a lot of controversy coming along with the discussion of plant-based proteins in particular with this particular definition. The U.S. Cattlemen's Association supports this definition. However, they have petitioned the U.S. Department of Agriculture to redefine meat as the flesh of an animal that has been raised, slaughtered, and harvested in the quote-unquote traditional manner. This raises the question, if animal flesh can be raised without requiring the animal, can it still be meat? And people in the cellular agriculture field, such as myself, believe it can, because at the end of the day, it is genetically identical to what you would be getting in the animal. It's raised in a very similar way in that you're replicating all of those bodily processes you would find in vivo. It's just not actually in the animal itself. However, this is still a subject of contention and is bound to be a big topic of conversation moving forward, particularly when it comes to regulating these products, as we've seen a lot in the plant-based industry already, and sort of, can you actually label this stuff as meat, or are we going to have to develop some other language or some other qualifications? The second question is it safe? One of the first questions many people have about cellular agriculture and cell-based meat is who's in charge of making sure it's safe? And that really depends on where you are in the world. So in Europe, new regulation has put the European Commission in charge of approving and regulating novel foods, including cell-based meat. In Singapore, the Singapore Food Agency announced that it'll oversee the development of a comprehensive regulatory framework to govern novel food production, which would include cell-based meat as well. And in the United States, where most cellular agriculture companies are based, the question was only recently raised. As the NCBA and UCSA have noted, the USDA regulates and oversees animal products like meat, milk, and eggs, but because cellular agriculture is in part, it is coming from cell cultures, which is a field that the FDA regulates, there has to be a bit of like collaboration between the two. And so over the past couple of years, this conversation has expanded, and in 2018, the USDA and FDA held a joint public meeting over the regulation of cell-based meat. And during the two-day event, they stated that they intend to jointly regulate these products. And this will be the first time actually ever that the two agencies are collaborating over any kind of regulation, which is kind of neat. It'll be interesting to see what the pathway the two agencies develop to actually move the field forward. And in 2019, they established this basic framework to regulate cell-based meat, putting into writing what was agreed upon the previous year. In regards to safety, one of the names that cell-based meat has been branded as is clean meat, and that name is meant to reflect sort of the ethical and environmental and health considerations of the field. In addition to the environmental benefits, cellular agriculture will likely be produced in very sterile environments where they'll be free from microbial contamination. But in the future, more studies and research will be conducted to ensure that the safety of cell-grown food, as well as the environmental impact, and to get a bit more precise about these predictions. Third question is it a GMO? So since cell-based meat comes from unmodified animal cells, although it doesn't necessarily have to, but it does in general come from unmodified animal cells, it won't be considered a GMO. Therefore, cell-based meat will not contain these genetically modified organisms, But having said that, there are some valuable lessons that cell-based meat and cellular agriculture as a field in general can learn about the launch of GMOs and avoid making the same mistakes. So there's still a lot of public mistrust surrounding GMOs. When genetically modified foods first came onto the market, there was little public education or information about the new technology. For instance, there's a lot of questions like, are they safe and healthy to eat? You know, what'll happen if I eat them? These kinds of things. But with little public information about the technology, other actors filled the gaps in information and not to promote a new technology that they didn't know much about. And what emerged was a lot of public fear and mistrust about the technology and what was actually going into their food. The cellular agriculture space is learning from these lessons, and it's something that we should be learning from, because most startups that are seeing a lot of success right now are doing so in part because they're adopting a process of radical transparency in which they're just trying to be as open and as honest about what this whole technology is about. Because as with any novel change, people can get pretty nervous, especially when it comes to creating things that really since the beginning of time we've been enjoying. So these kinds of conversations are things that the cellular agriculture industry has been very conscious of. So future obstacles. So the regulatory framework is probably one of the single greatest barriers to cellular agriculture. In the United States, where most cellular agriculture companies are based, as I touched on before, the answer was only recently sort of solved between the two, USDA and the FDA. In Canada, however, the conversation is a lot farther behind. And Cellular Agriculture Canada in particular, as an organization, that's one of the things that we do is we try to collaborate with bodies like Health Canada and other federal agencies in order to try to establish more clarity around the regulatory framework. So one of the things that we did last year was we held a panel with the Health Canada and a couple other agencies to basically explain what the existing novel foods regulatory framework is that is meant to sort of guide the introduction of new foods and new processes that create foods into Canadian society, and try to understand exactly what the things are that need to happen, need to be into place in order to actually introduce a regulatory framework specifically to cellular agriculture. The only country in the world at the moment which has seen any kind of regulatory success is Singapore. So at the end of December 2020, actually, they had regulatory approval for cultivated chicken made from an American company called Eat Just. And now, so for over a year in Singapore, you can go and you can buy cultured meat off a store shelf. Many other countries, like of course the US, but also Israel, they have been pretty proactive in increasing these conversations with regulators to try to move it forward and gain regulatory approval. The next one is public perception. So no matter how safe or sustainable cellular agriculture may make animal products, or how many regulations are put into place in order to ensure safety, it ultimately comes down to consumers and the public to accept cellular agriculture. As with most novel technologies, time will tell to see how the public perceives and accepts this new category as sustainable. A lot of actors in the field are trying to promote cellular agriculture as being transparent, and as well as promoting the positive environmental implications. And research has shown that when taught about the sustainabilities of cellular agriculture in comparison to conventional animal products, people view it more positively and are more interested in trying it, as opposed to if they just heard about cellular agriculture without any of sort of the background, as opposed to like why they would want to maybe consider this as a way of producing food. Research has also shown that rather than qualitative labels like the Rainforest Alliance certified sticker that would require prior knowledge to understand what they mean, quantitative labels are helpful. So there have been suggestions of quantitative labels, like labeling food about like, this is how much water it took to produce this product. This is how many emissions were implicated in the production of this product. Things like that, just like a nutrition label that add in that sustainability those sustainability aspects in numbers as opposed to words or certifications, which would require more of a breadth of knowledge as to what those actually mean. For the world's Jewish and Muslim populations, of course, it's yet to be determined whether cell-based meat can actually be labeled as kosher or halal, respectively. It'll be important for all actors in the field to fully address this and any other cultural questions or concerns that emerge as cellular agriculture enters the market. And of course, a key challenge that cellular agriculture and a lot of innovative technologies have to face is the socioeconomic impact of what their technology might cause. So in the United States, over 1.6 million people are employed by the livestock industry, which makes up about 22% of all income from agricultural exports. And worldwide, even more people, about 1/7 of the world, somehow is implicated in agriculture directly. And a lot of the times that is really subsistence farmers in developing nations. If cellular agriculture successfully enters the market and one day becomes large enough to disrupt the livestock industry, what would happen to all the people involved in this industry? That's a question. While this isn't a question that the cellular agriculture companies are necessarily asking, it's an important political question that may have severe implications. And in order for cellular agriculture to be successful and widespread, there will need to be political support, either in the form of positive policies or a lack of negative targeting policies. You know, questions like, will politicians and governments embrace the technology or will they feel threatened by it? It's important to balance the needs of one's constituents and citizens, of course, with the needs for a sustainable food system that provides enough to feed the world by 2050. And I think in Canada in particular, as we all know, the agriculture and livestock industry in particular makes up a really big component of our economy. And so if we're just kind of negligently transitioning out of that, there's a lot of livelihoods that would be at stake. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and this was one of the main subjects of conversation, sort of these things around a quote unquote just transition. And one of those things has to do directly with the social implications. And one of the members of the conference, there is a professor at Guelph University, said that, you know, if we're designing the facilities that produce cultivated meat or cultivated products in general, so that they can only be operated by a PhD, we're doing it wrong. These facilities and our production have to be designed in such a way that people who are currently in the livestock industry, so people who currently have the skills to be in farming, which are, you know, very extensive and very in-depth skill sets, those kind of skill sets need to be transferable or need to be made transferable to these kinds of alternative ways of producing food in order to sort of not only maintain individual livelihoods, but maintain the extent to which agriculture is a benefit for our nation's economy. So in summary, cellular agriculture has come a long way in the past 10 years since that first $330,000 burger that took 3 months to create. Right now, there are hundreds of startups around the world. The regulatory frameworks in those conversations are happening in a number of different countries, and there's generally increased public awareness. And of course, as great as I think this technology to be, in my personal opinion, I'm very conscious of the fact that it's only one possible solution alongside a lot of many other possible solutions in protein specifically, but also in agriculture in general. I don't think it's going to be sort of like a unilateral kind of cellular agriculture coming in and replacing everything that we currently know and think about with food, at least definitely not at first. I think it's going to be a much gradual sort of transition, and especially if we're able to, you know, produce it in a way that's either produce the things that we know and love that in the same way or better for the same price or less, this might be something that picks up more traction. But at the end of the day, it is only one technology and one possible solution in an array of many different solutions. So thank you all for listening. I have put my email there if anyone has any questions or curious about reaching out moving forward. But I mean, right now, I'd be really open to any questions that anyone has or anything you want to talk about more deeply out of any of the things that I said. So yeah, I'll stop my screen sharing here.
Okay, so thank you very much to Avery for such a comprehensive presentation there. That was fantastic. I'd like everyone to come off mute and give a proper old-fashioned round of applause for her efforts this evening. Thank you so much for. Thank you very much, Avery. Now, the obvious question we got to kick it off with is, what did that burger taste like?
Yeah, so when it was taste tested on television in London, they had like a whole panel of people, a couple people, a few who were actual chefs, a couple who were just sort of lay people. And in 2013, they said it had a similar bite and texture as a conventional burger. It was just a bit dry. That was kind of like the one big difference. But moving on since then, there have been taste tests of other things like steak. A couple years ago, the first steak to be cultivated in Israel. Salmon is one that's happening in the United States right now. And those are said to be like very, very similar. With a few blind taste tests, they've been almost indistinguishable.
Wow. Okay, because that's got to be one of the biggest stumbling blocks to consumer
Yeah.
acceptance. Obviously, if the product is in the ballpark at least, people are going to make those kind of concessions. But I just thought
Yeah,
I'd
for
start off
sure.
with that question. Now, please, anybody who has a question, please, you can raise your virtual hand, which can be found on the reactions or participants menu in Zoom, or just raise up your old-fashioned hand, and I'll see you on your screen if you've got your video on, and if you've got a good question for us. We'll go to Cameron first. Cameron, you've got a question for Avery.
Sure, yes. Avery, thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I was just curious what maybe the current or maybe what the expected relative carbon footprint of these artificial meats is going to be once we perfect or at least further perfect the technology.
Yeah, for sure. So over the past few years, there have been, I think, about 3 different life cycle analysis of cultivated beef in particular. And they've all shown slightly different results, but I think the one that is sort of held up internally in the industry as being the most realistic estimates that it will require 4% of the water, 4% of the energy, 4% of the water, 4% of the land, 1% of the emissions, and about 45% of the energy as is currently implicated in the production of beef. So kilogram for kilogram, it would be those percentages.
Wow.
There would be some variability.
Okay, impressive.
No problem. There would be some variability though. For instance, chicken, which is generally a less intensive kind of meat, and pork as well. It wouldn't be as significant of a margin, but it would probably be in that ballpark as well.
Sure, thank you.
George, you have a question for Avery.
Okay. Yeah, my question, Avery, is put on your forecaster hat on and suggest to us what would be the timeline of those products becoming available on the market at a, and not, okay, the first part is available on the market and available at the price that will attract people to buy it.
Yeah, so when looking at Canadian companies specifically, there's only about 4 startups that are working in the space. So there's one that's working on dairy, a couple on meat, and one on a non-food application. And technologically, they are a little bit, I guess, not as technologically advanced as some of their American or international counterparts. So in terms of when coming to the market, I think with price parity, it depends sort of on the speed of the regulatory approval, but also on whether the regulatory approval might be easier or harder for international providers. So for instance, if an American startup, which is more technologically advanced, is able to gain regulatory approval faster than a Canadian startup, then I think the two would sort of come at the same time with price parity and actually being able to try some of these things out. Because right now, we're not exactly at price parity, but I think within a couple years, we will be. And then in terms of actually being able to buy cultivated products in Canada, I'd say it's probably going to be another 3 to 4 years when we see it. We're starting to have these conversations, and there's a lot more awareness developed in the past couple of years amongst agencies like Health Canada. But in terms of actually establishing it and sort of meeting anticipated pushback, as we've seen in other countries, particularly with plant-based proteins and conventional agriculture, it'll probably be another 3 to 4 years, I'm going to guess.
Okay, thank you, George. Linda has a question now. Linda.
Hello.
Hello.
I got 3 questions. The first one is, would you be able to do stuff like salmon and haddock like fish?
Yeah, for sure. So you definitely would be. Honestly, you'd be able to make anything, not even just meat, but anything that comes from an animal, anything that grows from cells or from proteins that you could think of if you are able to acquire the cell line. So things like salmon, there's a company called Wild Type in, I think they're in California. They are working on salmon specifically, and they're sort of at the stage where they have samples. They're just not as at full capacity production yet. And they're working on regulatory framework. But there's a startup in Australia that's working on producing kangaroo, which is pretty neat. There's a company in Spain that's working on producing some heritage Iberico pig pork. So there's a lot of also different like interesting applications of meat that might be really rare because we don't farm that animal or they're an endangered species, but they once held a lot of cultural significance, for instance, and sort of actually being able to reintroduce those. So yeah, there's a big range for sure.
Okay, my second question is like when the meat was first tasted, it was dry. So I guess I don't know, how do you guys do the meat so you have the fat marbled in with the cells, like the muscles, like, and how would you do like ribs?
Yeah. So the first thing about like the fat versus the muscle, that is still a bit of like a stepping stone when it comes to research, because both of those, like fat cells and muscle cells, have different metabolic requirements. So trying to culture them together is a little bit of a roadblock right now in terms of like trying to create that ideal environment for both of them. But when it comes to producing things like ribs, things that have a bone, that comes down to the scaffold. And actually ribs haven't been done yet. So I think the most complex thing in terms of like tissue arrangement that has been done has been a steak, because, and that was really, it was really tricky just because getting that marbling with the fat. So things like ribs, chicken legs, anything that has a bone is going to be like another challenge in and of itself for sure.
Okay, and my third question is about sanitation, like what would how would you be able to monitor like when you do the meat, how would you know before you bring it out to the customer whether or not it's, because we've had this with the baby food in the States.
Yeah. So I have to say, this is the safety aspects of things. It's definitely not my background, but from what I do know is that it's anticipated to be monitored in a similar way to things like beer and fermented yogurt. So anything that's already produced in a very similar way using a bioreactor that has to do with cell cultures and fermentation and those kinds of things. It's in a very similar setup. So the safety considerations would be very similar. There probably actually is less risk of contamination in a way because it is produced in a very sterile environment as opposed to an environment where you have a lot of different animals like walking around, potentially exchanging pathogens and things like that. But in terms of actually like quantifying a safety process for these bioprocesses, that's still something that is in the process of being developed.
Okay, and what's your forecast for getting us some ribs?
So I say, yeah, no, for sure. I mean, hopefully 3 years, maybe more. Like, I think that has the added challenge of like, it's just also a more difficult thing to produce. So it might be a bit longer, maybe like 5 years or something like this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Good questions. We'll go to Misha next. Misha, you've got a question for Avery or a comment?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I have a question. So what's the current world record for growing any kind of meat? And is there maybe a theoretical limit on the speed of growing some meat? Maybe what are the current projections
for sure
regarding the speed of growing?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, this was a subject of research at Tufts University in the States, which actually they're doing a lot of good work right now because in the States, they've recently been named the National Institute of Cellular Agriculture. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on there. But a couple of years ago, they did this study, sort of like this analysis of the economics of producing cell-based meat, like how long it would take, how much it would cost to produce a kilogram of beef. And producing like a kilogram, I believe, depending on how big your bioreactor is, took about 28 days. It was about 4 weeks, if I remember correctly. And so I think there would be added considerations depending on the complexity and the cell type. But as like a standard kind of thing, it would be about 4 weeks from sort of like your individual cell line to like a whole bunch, like a commercially scale product, like volume of ground beef kind of thing.
Is it already faster than natural growing? I don't know what's the natural speed.
Yeah. So right now it's not done on this scale, and you can't really like go out and actually access this. But in smaller batches, like this has been proven to be possible. The scaling though, and actually like getting not just those 28 days for however much meat you're producing, but trying to replicate that across like an industrial level of process is not something that's really done yet.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, thank you very much, Misha. Nice to have you here. We'll go to Varma next. Varma, a question or a comment for Avery?
Yeah, thanks, Richard, and thanks, Avery, for that presentation. I think it's really an interesting topic, and I do think this is sort of the future of meat. I think we've already seen that there is a bit of an appetite, pun intended, for meat substitutes when we look at things like Impossible Burgers and that. I'm kind of intrigued by your mention of things like the heritage Iberico ham. So we know that there are degenerative diseases, which I don't believe can be transferred through the digestive system right now, but things like cancers and there's many others, Tay-Sachs and those types of things, Alzheimer's. Is there a concern that by endlessly reproducing these same cells, that there's a possibility of health effects in the future? And sort of a separate but related question, are there concerns that there are copyright or patent issues which will sort of be accelerated by this whole process? We know that already exists with things like Monsanto, but there's so much more money in the meat industry. Are we afraid that might accelerate those ethical issues?
Yeah, for sure. So to answer the first question, in looking at the health risks that are associated with reproducing cells over and over and over again, these are actual concerns that, this might introduce poor quality of cells, that could introduce diseases into our food supply. This is a possibility, and that has been raised. And I think like research is still being done in order to actually see like how likely of a possibility this is going to be. A lot of testing does go into figuring out the viability and health of your initial cell lines, but that would definitely have to go into the safety assessments of any cultivated meat process that is like actually going to go to consumers. So this is an interesting question that has been raised. I have to say that there isn't a lot of like knowledge on the subject yet of like those health risks of degenerative diseases, but yeah, it's a very interesting question for sure. Thank you for raising it. And then I think for your second question about IP, this is something we've recently started talking about in Canada in particular. New Harvest, I was affiliated with them a couple years ago, and their executive director, Isha Datar, she's super cool. She has a TED Talk on cellular agriculture. I highly recommend anyone check that out if you're interested in hearing more. And one of the things I recently sort of learned from her when I was talking to her was patents. We don't, in particular in Canada, we don't really want to sort of go down the route of one company is able to acquire a patent for the bioprocess of cellular agriculture in general and sort of just have a monopoly on producing like anything and everything to do with cellular agriculture, because that'll kind of reduce the amount of competition and reduce innovation. And in particular, if we're thinking of like us wanting to disrupt the meat industry in general, that isn't really conducive to collaboration and things like that. But what Isha was telling me was that she almost wants us to sort of think about this in a similar way as the micro brewing industry has thought about it. So small scale batches in a way that are very localized as a kind of like ethos having to do with it, but not actually having to require like individual patents to produce what you need to produce. And she thinks like on a larger scale, it could take the shape of what the software industry is currently doing. So few software companies have patents, certainly, but a lot of software that is being developed now doesn't actually rely on patents, but more just relies on the proficiency of what it is that they're actually putting out into the world. So patents and kind of like IP and these sorts of things are definite risks, and it's kind of hard to know like how to actually sort of curb that. But it's definitely like something I think we're moving away from in the cellular agriculture industry, just given sort of the nature of where we're at with very like small companies kind of thing. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you, Varma. Just a question from myself on this one. You talked about earlier on about reaching price parity.
Mm-hmm.
Is that one of the biggest challenges? Because I would have thought that given the newness of the technology and even given other products in the vegetable protein sphere, they seem to have had a difficult time in competing on a price basis, or maybe they're not even trying to compete. So do you see this as being as something that's surmountable, of getting it down to a point where the price parity can be reached?
Yes, I do think we're very much capable of achieving price parity.
Wow.
Because for instance, in Singapore, it almost is very similar and comparable in prices. That usually has to do with like the maturity of a technology, which sort of, as time goes on, almost seems to inevitably happen. It's just kind of like a matter of time. And I don't think like price parity on its own is going to be the thing that convinces people to adopt cell-based meat as opposed to anything else. I just think if it's not comparable in price, it will be an inhibitor. So I think not having price parity is going to hold us back. Having price parity isn't really going to push us forward. It's just going to sort of like level the playing field in a way, but I think it is definitely possible.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to go to Kelly. Kelly is a first timer. Kelly, go ahead with your question, then we'll get to Linda.
Avery, you said that one of the 4 Canadian companies is working on non-food uses.
Yes.
I'm curious, what kind of stuff, not necessarily this one company, but I immediately started thinking like blood transfusions or leather, or like, what are they doing?
Yeah, so I think the one in Canada, Hyacinth Bio, was specifically looking at actually medical marijuana. And internationally, a lot of the different companies, so there is leather, as you pointed out, Modern Meadow is working on leather. There's silk. Let's see, there are other sort of like animal hides, those kinds of things. There's one company that's working on ivory from elephants and rhinos and these sorts of things for jewelry. Those are the main ones. Yeah.
Wow.
Thanks.
No problem.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. And we'll come back to Linda now. Linda, another question. or comment?
Hello, my compliments to Varma. You asked some very terrific questions, and one that I actually was concerned about, which would be the monopolization of the food supply. So those questions were answered. So thank you for the questions, Varma. Terrific. Everybody else did terrific questions too. But my questions have to do with eggs and milk and other like that are not directly meat. But can you give me a forecast on eggs, milk, and butter and stuff like that?
For sure. So actually, so eggs, milk, butter are produced in slightly different ways than meat and leather and those kinds of things are. Because instead of coming from cells, the way they're usually produced is by extracting the DNA that codes for that protein. So the DNA that codes for milk protein, and by putting that into something like yeast. So inserting that into the yeast and then getting the yeast to divide over and over again, and then just express the milk protein, and then you get your milk like that. And so you can actually buy cultivated milk, not as milk, but in ice cream. So there is a company that is in the United States called Perfect Day, and they have this brand of ice cream called Brave Robot. It's not widely available, but in a few places you can get it, and it's produced using cell-based dairy proteins, and so that's actually already something you can get. Eggs hasn't been done quite yet, but I think things like eggs and milk and butter, so acellular products as we call them, are probably actually going to be able to achieve regulatory approval faster than meat. So that might honestly be like a couple years as opposed to like 3 to 5.
Sorry. Thank you. You're doing a great presentation, Avery. Thank you so much for that. So I'll just leave it if someone else has a question.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda. Yeah, certainly Avery's got all the answers for us here tonight. So who has another great question for her? I love the comment that you made, Avery, talking about the regulatory approval sort of environment in the United States, that the FDA and the USDA are kind of trying to figure out what's happening. And then you said about how that they've decided to do this jointly, and you put it as neat. And I think that's an amazing euphemism for 2 layers of regulatory approval, 2 bodies that are known to be not exactly efficient when it comes to getting regulatory approval, working together. It sounds like a horrible situation, and I'm glad at least we don't have that double layer, or do we have a double layer potential in Canada?
Yeah, so in Canada, from our initial conversations last year, it doesn't seem like it's going to be a bunch of organizations vying to regulate the same thing. It's going to depend on sort of the application. So Health Canada is going to be, it seems like human-based foods are in their jurisdiction, but when it comes to pet food, actually, which is another big application, there's a startup in the States working on it, that's going to be monitored by another agency, and seafood actually will probably be monitored by another agency. So this might introduce some kind of friction or some kind of sort of like bureaucratic hangup, but I think even from the get-go right now, there is a sort of idea of the separation of different things and things falling in different people's jurisdictions. So hopefully we won't come to like this sort of power struggle where a bunch of people are trying to like get the regulatory approval like as something that's in their jurisdiction. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Avery. We'll go to Jerry as a first-time caller. Jerry.
Hi, Avery. You mentioned this cellular food is created in these large reactors like microbreweries. And I'm just curious if one batch of cellular meat from one reactor would potentially taste different from another one, and if that could be used to differentiate between suppliers.
Yeah. So the bioreactor is responsible for simulating things like temperature, for simulating sort of like the amount that cells are mixed around together, and so like how the nutrients and things are distributed. So things like that would probably not so much influence the taste, because I think the taste would come from kind of like what's in the culture media itself, but probably like the quality. So things like how tough the meat is, things like how homogenous the taste of the meat is. And so things like that definitely would probably be something that you could use to differentiate between like who is supplying the meat and like how good one supplier is over the other.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jerry. We'll go back to George now. George.
Okay, back to forecasting, Avery. When I asked you before, when you expect it to be on the market, you said 3 years. Earlier, you said that different types of meats have different levels of complications or in simplicity, and the ground meat, let's say the one that was tasted that cost $300,000 back in 2012 or something, is probably the simplest one. Okay, all that makes sense. Do you expect that the ground equivalent of cellular meat would come before 3 years?
I think that'll probably be 3 years. Like, okay. I think ground meat, because right now, actually, the lab in the Netherlands that cultivated that burger announced a couple years ago that they think the price would only actually now be $12, which is still a lot more than your conventional burger, but it's a big difference from 330,000. And so I think that will probably be kind of like the first meat thing. So I think in terms of like the order, I think it'll be like milk and egg proteins first, and then I think it'll be things like ground beef or chicken nuggets or meatballs or like things that are very processed next. And then I think things like steaks and ribs and things like that will be after, not because of the regulatory process, but I think that would just be like the technology itself developing.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, George. We'll go back to Misha now. Misha.
Did you know if some companies working on a, let's say, completely artificial meat, so a new sort of meat, maybe a mix of existing to improve taste, healthiness, I don't know, any kind of quality of meat?
Yeah, for sure. So I don't actually know of any startups doing this, but there has been this idea raised recently of what's kind of called like hybrid meat. So part conventional meat, part cultivated meat, to kind of introduce it to consumers. And if it's not feasible to do it all one way, sort of like a bridge between the two. And in the past year or so, a lot of really large conglomerates, so like Tyson, Cargill, JBS, so some of like the really top meat firms in the world, have started investing in cellular agriculture research and development. So I think when it comes to these hybrid products, I kind of foresee us seeing them come out of these investments. So the investments from really big meat conglomerates as opposed to startups, because they already have a lot of infrastructure and interest when it comes to conventional meat and sort of like the blend of the two.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Misha. I had a question that was actually a comment and a question. One that originates from a comment that in the chat from Varma that's saying that pet food is a huge potential market, and I could certainly see that. I know a friend of mine. She's vegan, and she has a dog, and she's kind of kept the dog on a relatively a low meat diet. But when this dog was ailing, she felt like she had to do what she did for the health of the pet and give it as much, real meat protein as possible. But I could see that there's a real ethical quandary. There would be a lot of pet owners in the United States and Canada who are vegetarian, vegan on their own and want their pet not to be, to contribute to the problem that they're trying to solve themselves. So a huge opportunity, I guess, for the industry to provide a pet food that doesn't have some of the problems that maybe the rest of the market has of acceptance of regulatory approval and lower levels of regulatory approval. Is that kind of, are there companies heading in that direction?
Yes. So there was actually one that started in Canada a few years ago, but then moved I think they're based in North Carolina. A lot of companies are based in North Carolina right now, interestingly, because there's a lot of like really good technical support there, but they're called Because Animals. And so they're working on producing the protein part that goes into animal food. There's also, I think, one in Colorado, Bond Pet Foods. They started off as like a vegan pet food thing and plant-based pet food sort of firm, and now they're looking at doing things with cultivated protein. So it's definitely a really big opportunity. I personally haven't looked a lot into kind of like what the market size is, but I think like Because Animals projects that it is like half, or not half, but like maybe like a third of the size of the human food market in the States. So it definitely is a really big opportunity for sure.
Okay, thank you very much. And just the comment was basically that if you look at animal agriculture, kind of flip it around and compare animal agriculture to the cellular agriculture. Every animal is its own bioreactor and is producing,
Yes.
essentially takes time to produce what it produces. A chicken, takes 2 months to produce just over a pound of meat. Actual meat from the chicken. A cow, 18 months to produce about 500 pounds of meat, and of course everything along the way to support that animal, to feed it, to water it, to make sure it's in good health, etc. And so when you compare it on those terms, this is not at all outlandish. This is, you're producing what you're producing. You're not producing a lot of byproducts. You're not producing 5 pounds of chicken to get 1 pound of meat. You're not producing 1,200 pounds of beef to get 500 pounds of end product beef. Of course, there's a lot of byproducts there, I guess, but yeah, it seems like a very efficient process.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd say it's a really nice way you put that actually there, because unfortunately, it's been in the Western world in the past 100 years or so, we've come to really view farm animals almost like a machine. Like you just raise them because you just want them to produce eggs or milk or meat or these sorts of things. So although they're treated like a machine, they're actually a very inefficient machine, because when you raise a whole cow, you're only actually using 3% of it, like the cuts here and there, the energy that gets in, because you're not just putting the energy in to raise the meat, you're putting it in to like raise the whole animal, all their bodily processes, all the waste that they generate in their entire lives. So if we're looking at it as a machine, it's actually like a very inefficient one. So things like a bioreactor, if we view the animal as a bioreactor, we're essentially doing the same thing, just hopefully in a much more effective way.
Thank you. Back to Linda again. Linda.
Is there a time where the cellular meat might be cheaper than the meat that's produced by the animals?
Yes, I think that's a very definite possibility. I think if we can achieve price parity, there's no reason why we couldn't be cheaper than conventional meat. And I think that's just a function of time and kind of the development. Like those first iterations definitely won't be cheaper, but as time goes on, yeah, for sure, I think it's a possibility.
Okay, Varma, question from you.
The comparison to microbrews has me thinking of the branding possibilities. Off the top, I was thinking Herman Melville's India Pale Whale, Pigner. There's possibilities there. That's not my question though. I'm wondering, biotechnologies like mRNA technology or CRISPR, do those have a place in this sphere right now?
Yeah. So that kind of intersects with the GMO conversation in a way, because if you do use things like CRISPR to modify your cell lines, it technically would be a GMO. And at the beginning, right now, companies aren't as interested in doing that because they sort of don't want to have to fight like the GMO battle at the same time as like just fighting the cultivated meat battle. But that being said, in the future, I think there are a lot of possible intersections, because right now, when we eat meat, it's very dependent on the health of the animal. But once you have these cell lines, you could use like mRNA technologies. You could use CRISPR to actually augment some of the nutritional qualities of what you're eating, and augment some of like the organoleptic qualities, so things like taste and texture using CRISPR for sure. So right now it's not something that is really being discussed or done, but there's really not a reason why it couldn't be in the future.
Yeah, great question, Varma. Thank you. Thank you for that. Linda?
Actually, my in relationship to my cheaper question, how is this going to help third world countries?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Right now, a lot of the companies in the cellular agriculture field are in not Western nations, but they are in like developed nations. So North America, Europe, Eastern Asia. And the reason being is because I think of just like the level of technology that it does require. And at the moment, I personally think that cellular agriculture doesn't necessarily make sense for individual subsistence farmers who might be in developing nations who kind of work independently, aren't working under huge conglomerates, just because of, I think, the scale of technology that is going to actually be required to make that make sense for them. Because there's a lot of upfront costs when it comes to like getting, you know, the bioreactors, getting the people to work at these stations, that it's really going to be like of a scale that is infeasible for people who are making their entire living sort of without a lot of external support, as is commonly, from my understanding, the case in developing nations. So it is a good question, because we definitely don't want this with a just transition to in any way adversely impact developing nations. But I think like right off the top of my head, like directly, it's not something that at the moment, in sort of the state that it is in, existing forms of animal agriculture would make more sense for people in developing nations who are farmers and who make their livelihoods that way than cellular agriculture, at this moment at least. But that's not to say that in the future there won't be models of this framework that don't make sense for them, or that make sense for them. But at the moment, not really.
Okay, thank you, Linda, again. We'll go to Misha now.
Yeah, so as I understand, there are kind of two alternatives, either to grow cells or to produce proteins, let's say, directly, like you mentioned, from yeast or from bacteria.
Yes.
So is it correct that the cellular agriculture is more about taste, while to just make nutrition, it's okay to go with protein? And which one is faster maybe, or cheaper, so more productive?
Yeah, so you are right. And I think like it doesn't necessarily have to, it doesn't really only depend on like the taste. It's just sort of dependent on how that's actually produced in the body. So things like meat and leather, they come from cells. So that's why those bioprocesses use cells, whereas things like milk and eggs are produced from proteins, not because of like about like how they taste, but just because in the body they are produced using protein. So milk is just, it's a protein coming out rather than a cell. And egg proteins, like egg white proteins, are they're proteins rather than cells. In terms of which one is, I guess, more feasible, it's definitely going to be the protein ones, because those are already things we already know how to do in a way, just we haven't always used them directly for protein production. So things like insulin or rennet, which is an enzyme used in cheese making, those are already things that are produced at industrial scales using fermentation technologies. The only difference really between things like casein, which is found in cheese, is that it is just a different protein. The bioprocess would be almost exactly the same. It would just have to go through like a different regulatory approval process, which is kind of like the main hang up here.
But in general, to, let's say, feed more people, it's easier to use those bacteria-produced proteins, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. It would be easier to produce it using proteins. The thing is, you just can't produce like meat using proteins. You'd have to go through the cells to do that.
Yeah, but when we digest, we still kind of consume proteins. We don't consume cells, so we don't care about cells when we eat them. We just care about chemical components of those cells.
Yeah, that's true. Like you could sort of in a way like isolate those proteins. It just wouldn't be like the same eating experience, but nutrition wise, it would be the same. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, we'll go back to George now. George.
Okay. When you are describing the process of creating the meats and all these cellular products, we have the original cell, we have the bioreactor, and then we have all the environment where that creates the feed that the cell grows in and reproduces. Now, my question is, are all the components that you have to put in this, in that bioreactor and any of the other ingredients, let me just use the word ingredients, are they can they all be securely sourced, or are there some products that we may have problems securing from, whether it's a matter of importation or whether maybe it's rare itself and that's a problem in securing or anything like that? Any concerns there?
Yeah, so most things, so usually the culture media is made of something called the basal media, which contains like really basic things, a lot of sugars, some amino acids, some salt. All of those things are very easy to source. The things that are slightly more difficult to actually procure are the things called the growth factors, which come from what I was talking about a little bit earlier, which is FBS or fetal bovine serum. Those are really hard to source because right now FBS is really hard to source because it's expensive and it's pretty rare. And then sourcing the growth factors in a way that doesn't come from FBS is also really hard. So the growth factors are the main thing that's like, it's really difficult to find. Everything else is really easy to get at like a pharmaceutical grade. So it's also even easier to get at a food grade.
So, sorry, follow up. When you say it is hard to get, and that was with regard to the alternative to the fetal bovine thing, is it alternative because it's hard to make, or is it there is some it's only available from a particular source? Is it technologically hard to produce? Which of these 3 or 4?
Yes. It's because it's technologically hard to produce, because there are a few startups who are working on actually producing these alternatives, but there isn't like one widespread alternative. And so you kind of have to like go through a specific startup, which them in of themselves are like still in the process of actually fine tuning it and trying to make it cheaper in those things. So it's harder because it's just technically it's harder to produce.
Understand. Okay. Good. Just an observation, I should say. We were talking about the jobs and the livelihoods that are produced in the animal agriculture industry, and though those are sometimes very well paid jobs, they're not nice jobs. I mean, they're tough, nasty jobs. They're often done in the United States, certainly in the slaughterhouses. Most of the slaughterhouse labor is, in fact, of undocumented people, because it can be low paid, but it's very unpleasant work. It's very dangerous work. It's you are injured. You're going very fast a lot of the time. The chances for repetitive strain injuries are very high, and it's traumatic as well, because essentially you're there witnessing the deaths of 100 or hundreds of animals an hour, and they're not always going pleasantly. And apart from that, it's a dirty environment. It's a messed up environment, in the fact that it's blood, it's guts, it's feces, it's manure, and that's not just in the slaughterhouse procedure. That's all the way along. So I think that when we talk about job loss here and about the just transition, eliminating a lot of those jobs that people do that actually are a livelihood, but not a very good one. It can be akin to replacing jobs from the mining industry with technology and saying, well, less miners, but they're using, technology to produce the same amount of ore that they were producing before. And so this is actually, these jobs, as I said, are their jobs, their livelihoods, but they're not exactly the ones that we would think we would want to preserve for our society and for everyone around the world. Just a comment.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a lot of validity to that because I remember like a couple years ago when the COVID-19 pandemic was first becoming a thing. I believe there was a news story that in Edmonton, in a meat packing facility, like a lot of the workers got COVID really quickly because of like the environment they were in. It was like moist, sort of like cold, like there's a lot of meat just around and open. And so it is people's livelihoods, but when we think of farming, we think of sort of like a really bucolic kind of pastoral image, but the reality is the majority of like our food in the Western world comes from in like facilities like this where people aren't treated as well as they could be. There's a lot of personal risk, there's a lot of environmental risk, and it is an interesting, I think, cultural phenomenon in in the way of saying, if you're a person who eats meat or a lot of animal products, but you're not actually directly implicated in the production of those, it's kind of an unprecedented part, I think, in our evolution as a species, that we sort of really compartmentalized like the suffering we inflict on other creatures, not just in killing them, but also in raising them in a certain way. And we sort of like allocated that to like a person in like this corner of the world, and we don't want to see it, we don't want to interact with it, and so it's sort of like, I think it does like weird things to us as people when we don't actually have to be like implicated in that, and we can sort of outsource the suffering we cause and like sort of put it all on like people who are treated really poorly for a number of different reasons. So yeah, I think also like in a cultural way and sort of like the way we think about food and the way we think about what goes into food, that's also a conversation I personally hope cellular agriculture can bring about. Yeah.
Well, that's such a good comment, Avery. Certainly, I think that that part of this discussion is that we have to kind of we have to readjust that bucolic and pastoral view of agriculture and update it to the way things really are. And I think that a lot of people will not appreciate having that, pushed into their faces, but that's what accompanies eating meat. And that once we kind of adjust ourselves to that, we'll realize that maybe that the other alternatives are more palatable, and it may be one of those uncomfortable truths that we have to embrace before we can move on to other alternatives. George, question?
Yeah, not a question, just a comment. I think that the similarity between what you're describing about the work in the I guess in the slaughter industry in particular, it's the same consideration we have to think about as to work in the coal mining industry. Now, both of them are awful jobs, but it doesn't mean that if the jobs are eliminated, that people will just go in the night and say, "Oh, thank you, we can become computer programmers," and thanks, because we don't need to work in the coal mine again. I guess there are generations and generations that do the same work, and somehow they kind of accept it, even however awful it is, and they do it with pride, strange pride to us, but it's pride, and they say, yeah, it's awful, but we did it and we're proud of it. We just have to expect that. That's what I'm going to say.
Absolutely. Yeah, good point. Okay, well, it seems like we're winding down here. I think we've given Avery a really good workout here this evening. I think she's been up to every question we've thrown at her. And so, again, great thanks to Avery for being here this evening, for giving us such an amazing presentation on an area that is going to be something that we no doubt revisit over the next several years, and hopefully in 3 to 4 years' time, as Avery was talking about, we'll have the opportunity to buy it at our regular markets anywhere as an alternative. and give that a shot. So again, thank you for being here this evening. I've really enjoyed the presentation. I hope you have too. If you're a first timer to Café Scientifique, again, welcome and thank you for coming to the presentation this evening. We will be having more regular presentations both on the Café Scientifique side and the Halton Peel Humanist community. And so again, please don't lose our address. We'll be back here with other great presentations. And you can get an example of those actually if you go on our website, hp-hc.ca. We've got a whole YouTube channel with all of our regular presenters that we've had over the past few years. If you liked what Avery was saying, we have presenters from the McGill Speakers Bureau on scientific questions. So there's a few there that you're going to be of interest to. George?
Yeah, no, I want to suggest that people not only look at hphc.ca, but also at our channels on YouTube as Café Scientifique Mississauga. To Facebook, we have a group of Café Scientifique on Facebook, and our announcements are both on Facebook as Café Scientifique Mississauga, as well as on Meetup. So for Café Scientifique in particular, go to these 3 places: Meetup, Facebook, and YouTube. And again, it's you'll find it over there. And I think that once we post this individual, this particular webinar, we'll put it on Café Scientifique Mississauga YouTube.
Okay, thank you very much, George. George is our tech man. So again, thank you for attending this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and we'll look forward to seeing you back here in a Zoom space or in a real life space at the Stonehooker Brewery very soon. So thank you very much for coming tonight.